the former First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon. Maybe just take us a step back to the independence referendum.
This was the most miserable experience I had ever had. It was still an uphill struggle, but there was a sense of possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could pull this off. And in that moment, it felt we'd blown the whole thing.
It was like the Lib Dems, totally opportunistic.
We were never, can I just absolutely refute the suggestion that the SNP's ever been like the Lib Dems? That's the most insulting thing you've ever said to me. Women in politics are treated differently to men in almost every respect. The focus on what we wear, how we look, the tone of our voice. Being opposed to trans rights is, at the moment, the acceptable form of bigotry. And if you scratch the surface of that, you'll find that these people are also homophobic and sexist and misogynist.
I was genuinely surprised that you hadn't done more work on those questions.
I mean, we can also talk about some of your decisions that I still think were profoundly wrong if you want.
This episode is sponsored by HP. Now, Rory, I hear that Windows 10 is finally being put out to pasture this year.
It is, and something pretty relevant for you, Alastair, given what I've seen of some of your technology. It's going on October the 14th, to be exact. And after that, Microsoft is going to stop supporting some of those old laptops of yours. No updates, no security patches. So if you were still using it, or a business was still using Windows 10, it would be really exposed to cyber threats, for example. It would be like locking the door but leaving the key in the lock.
So it's time to move on, and HP are making that refreshingly straightforward.
Yes, they are. HP's latest business PCs comes with Windows 11 Pro as standard. They're faster, more secure, built for the AI tools which are already reshaping the way we work.
And you don't have to figure out all on your own. HP's business advisors help you pick the right kit, so no baffling jargon, just practical advice.
And here's the bonus. Rest is Politics listeners get 10% off business PCs at hp.com using the code TRIP10. Terms apply.
So unlock efficiency and innovation, upgrade to Windows 11 Pro PCs with HP and get 10% discount. Visit hp.com/politics to find out more.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics, leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Nicola Sturgeon. She is the longest serving of the 7 people who've been Scotland's First Minister since the Scottish Parliament was re-established in 1999. Thanking you, Labour. And so far, she's the only woman to have held that job. Like her hero, Robert Burns, Nicola was raised in a working class family in Ayrshire. Shy, introverted, bullied at school, but nonetheless became obsessed with politics and especially the Scottish National Party. And Rory and I have both been reading her autobiography, Frankly, which is a very personal, often very emotional account of her private and public lives, her rise through the SNP, many election campaigns, highs and lows of the fight for independence, the lows and lows of Brexit, her experience of dealing with no fewer than 5 UK prime ministers, very up and down relationship with Alex Salmond, and finally the police investigation into SNP finances, which led to an arrest that she says she'll never get over, ultimately divorced from her husband, longtime party CEO, Peter Murrell. She describes writing the book, and Rory and I can both identify with this, as a form of therapy. So in line with all good therapy sessions, let's start at the very beginning, Nicola. Childhood. First of all, thank you for giving us your time.
It's a pleasure.
But give us a flavour of your upbringing, because reading the book, it didn't feel very political to me.
It wasn't political at all, certainly not in any overt or explicit way. I grew up in a very ordinary, although in some ways I think these ordinary childhoods are actually quite extraordinary in many ways. My only real memory of hearing my parents talk about politics was the morning after the first devolution referendum, when there was a sense of disappointment over the breakfast table. But apart from that, I don't really remember much in the way of political chat at all. I found out after he died that my grandfather had been a member of the SNP in the 60s, so maybe something in the genes. But apart from that, I guess it was my grandfather's job and the circumstances around that, while I wouldn't have thought about it as politics at the time, shaped a lot of what became my political values. So yeah, it wasn't a political childhood, but it was one that certainly shaped the things that I came on to believe and try to pursue in politics.
Tell us what your granddad did.
My granddad was a gardener in a big estate house in the village that my dad was born in and my grandparents lived in, a fishing village on the west coast of Scotland called Dunure. He was the gardener there, and I used to get taken along to see him at work. And looking back on it, there was definitely a sense of them and us in the relationship between my granddad and his family and those who owned the estate house that he worked in. And my gran and granddad lived in a tied cottage, effectively, a house called the Croft. And when he died, my gran, even though she'd lived there for, I think, all of her married life, virtually raised 3 kids there, she lost that house because it was effectively taken away from her. And I remember a real feeling of anger and injustice that she was being treated in the way that she was. So I think looking back on it, that was probably quite a formative experience.
Is that something that you think is something that's still very true of Scotland today, or is that a portrait of a world that's changed a bit? Do you think that's still recognisable, that a young girl growing up like you in Esher today would experience something like that?
I think it's less likely. I suspect tenants' rights are stronger than they were back then. I think less people probably not less people work in those circumstances, but I suspect the sort of relationships and the manifestation of those relationships would be different. That said, and I don't think what I'm saying is unique to Scotland, of course there is still in my view, far too big a gap between those who have wealth and property and assets and those who don't. So in many ways, there are aspects of this that are still true in Scotland and I would guess across the UK today.
One of the things that I think is interesting across the United Kingdom is 2 different problems around class. One of them is a problem around kind of traditional ideas of social class, people with posh accents like me and people who don't have them. And then there's the very, very dramatic economic differences, which often don't coincide with those. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But increasingly in Britain, we're living in a very unequal society that's become more unequal than it was actually in the late 70s, early 80s when you were growing up, just in terms of wealth discrepancies, income discrepancies. And I wonder whether there isn't something a bit complicated there going on, which is as the old forms of class structure have collapsed and therefore are less visible, less kind of upstairs, downstairs, tied cottages, we're less conscious of the fact that actually our society's become in many ways much more unequal than it was 40, 50 years ago, just in terms of wealth.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is multi-layered complexity in that. And I suspect in some respects, this debate is different in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK. I'm generalising here, but put to one side the gap, the inequality in wealth and income, which I think in many respects is growing or has grown in recent times. But the identity issues around class in Scotland are almost separate from that. I mean, of course, there are, linkages and it's all integrally connected, but there is a sense of, I'm generalising here, but it strikes me on the part of many people in England, if you're working class, you aspire to be middle class. In Scotland, if you're middle class, you still aspire in some ways to be working class. There is a sense of working class is that's the identity that people have pride in. And so there is a separation between how wealthy you are and how you identify. So you might go on to have a professional job, a well-paying job, be actually quite affluent in Scotland, but will absolutely, fight tooth and nail for your working class identity. And I fall into that category, I think.
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's a big contrast with the US, where something like 90% of people claim to be middle class. And when politicians in the US, even Democrat politicians, address American voters, they call them middle class. When Alastair and I were at the convention, the Democrat convention, only one person used the word working class, which was the head of the trade union representatives. Otherwise, it's all middle class. And as you say, in Scotland, you have the other manifestation.
Yeah, it's almost an insult in Scotland for somebody to tell you you've kind of moved away from your working class roots and you're now middle class, even if by any, economic definition of class that is true. And it's my perception and impression that, it's certainly different to the US, as you say, but I think that's also a bit different to how people would perceive class in England as well.
There's a line in the book, Nicola, that really leapt out at me. You said, for schools like mine, it seemed like the job wasn't to raise our aspirations to meet our abilities. It was to lower them to fit our backgrounds. How much is that still the case?
I'd like to think that is not the case in the way that it was when I was growing up. I wouldn't sit here and claim that there is no vestiges of that in Scotland or elsewhere. I am a big believer in the comprehensive system of education, but I think it's important to guard against its potential weaknesses. I went to a good school and it served me well. You know, I went on to be one of the few people at my school to go to university, but it wasn't trying to do us down or hold us back out of any sense of malevolence. There was a sense of realism, or what would have been described as realism, about wanting to give us a pragmatic sense of what we could go on and achieve. I mean, I vividly remember a session I had with a guidance teacher, careers advisor at school, and told her that I wanted to go and study law. And I mean, she looked at me as if I had said I wanted to go to the moon. I think she told me I should think about being a teacher instead, as if that was somehow a more sort of, realistic ambition for somebody like me. Now, in my case, that made me more determined to go and do the thing I wanted to do. But I asked myself often, why was I one of just a few people at my school to go to university? I wasn't the only clever person at my school. I probably wasn't the cleverest person at my school. So why was it that there were so many people who were just as bright as me, possibly brighter, smarter than me, who didn't manage to follow a path like that?
Tell me about the bullying at school. You write in the book about
I wasn't bullied throughout my time at school. These were sort of distinct episodes. I was pretty quiet, introverted, shy. I still am all these things, although I find it harder to get people to believe it these days. And I was always slightly apart from others at school. But I was one of these people that kind of always, even when I was younger and very shy, I would pick my side in a debate or a fight. And there was these girls in my school who they'd be best of pals for a while and then they'd fall out and be sworn enemies. And I don't know, maybe it was because they sensed in me a kind of desire to fit in a bit more. They would provoke me into taking a side, and then I would take a side, fight the corner of the person whose side I'd taken. And then they'd make up and I'd be the sort of common enemy. And on a couple of occasions, on 2 occasions, one of these girls, what would be described in the west of Scotland, would still be described in the west of Scotland, battered me, which I vividly remember.
If we were to ask the people who were at school with you, would they say that you'd remained particularly close to them, or would they have felt that you've moved on into a world which is quite different? And what are the people who are at school with you doing now? If you think about your year group, what are they mostly doing now?
I'm not really in close contact with people I was at school with. So my closest friends or my oldest friends are people I met when I started at university. There is one school friend that I, did keep in touch with, and, we would see each other and would still sort of pick up where we left off. But our lives are so different, we don't have that much contact. When I go and visit, my parents still live where I grew up. So I'll often see people that I was at school with. I think a lot will probably still live where we grew up. I know one person I was at school with is a pharmacist and works locally, but the friendships that are close in my life now are friendships that are post-school.
As an MP in Cumbria, one of the interesting tensions was that particularly farmers in the Lake District would want their children to stay in Cumbria and continue to farm and stay in the valleys. Often the teachers were the people trying to encourage children to move out, have bigger aspirations, go to university, go to Manchester, go to wherever. I was thinking about this also in Switzerland, where there is a big focus on vocational training, and there's a sort of positive and negative, isn't there? Because some Swiss friends will say it's great because it keeps people realistic and embedded in their local community, and other people will say it's very restrictive, I wanted to do much more. You're presumably more on the side of the teachers that want to expand horizons and encourage people to spread their wings.
I'm not sure it's as binary as all of that. I'm a great believer that young people should be encouraged and supported to spread their wings as far and as wide as they want to. I'm a great believer that young people should have the opportunity, if they have the ability, to go to university. I don't believe university is or should be seen as the be all and end all. I don't think we, and this is not just Scotland, I think this would be true across the UK. And there's, governments that Alastair was part of, a lot of the policy that was pursued then, rightly or wrongly, contributed to this. I don't think we pay enough attention to vocational education. But I'm not sure that boils down to, it's vocational education and you stay where you grew up versus you go to university and you spread your wings and travel the world. I also think there is a sense of young people should be supported to go and spread their wings and develop themselves and find out what they want to do and what they want their place in society to be. And then if they want to, find their way back to the kind of community they grew up in. So I don't think we should try to shoehorn people into, very defined categories like that.
If your sort of politicisation didn't come, as it were, in the home, I'd be interested to know how big a role Margaret Thatcher played in radicalising you, making you feel that politics is where you needed to get to. And also whether at that stage, when you were a young woman, you would define yourself, and whether you still do, as a socialist.
I would, I think. I mean, I use the terminology of social democrat, left to centre, but if you push me, I certainly wouldn't shy away from the description socialist, and it's how I would have described myself as a youngster. Margaret Thatcher was a huge, huge factor in me becoming active in politics. I remember when she became, I vaguely remember when she became Prime Minister. I don't remember it all that clearly. I was 9 at the time, and I do have a kind of vague memory of thinking, there's a woman, leading the country. That's brilliant. I remember the Falklands War and thinking, I was on her side rather than whoever was on the other side. I didn't really understand it properly at the time. Fast forward a little bit from that, though, and we're into the depth of the kind of economic pain of Thatcherism. The community I grew up in, unemployment generally was very high, higher in Scotland and in my part of Scotland particularly than the average across the UK. There was a sense of, I choose my words carefully here, there was a sense amongst some people I was growing up with of hopelessness. You either would end up in a YTS, young training scheme as it was at the time, or on the dole. I mean, that undoubtedly fueled my desire to get to university and sort of get out of that. But the thing I probably remember, or the feeling I remember most strongly, was a terror of your dad losing his job. Because there was a sense then unemployment was not some temporary phenomenon. It would be terminal. If your dad lost his job, that was it. And that started to fuel a lot of anger in me about those conditions and those circumstances. The miners' strike was a big moment in developing, I guess, a sense of political tribalism on my part. So Thatcher undoubtedly was a key figure in making me a political activist.
I'm very interested in this because I think this is true for many, many people across Scotland and the north of England, and actually a lot of people in Britain. But I'm interested in whether some of that is her image, the way she spoke, as opposed to what was happening structurally. For example, I was talking to somebody who, like you, grew up in a new town in Scotland, and she gave a very similar account. Very similar to what you just said. But I know her very well, and her family were not miners. She wasn't directly connected to it. So she must have been seeing it as a child, largely on television. Your father was working, I guess, for Chubb. So he wasn't in a heavily unionized, nationalized industry. In fact, he was in quite a sort of growing, successful part of the Scottish economy.
He was a strong trade unionist.
A strong trade unionist, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe that's part of it. I mean, I just, looking back on it, how much of it is that the world changed dramatically from Jim Callaghan to Thatcher, and how much of it is that Thatcher became a kind of horrifying symbol of everything that was going wrong in the 70s and 80s?
There's some truth in that. I think for somebody growing up in the west of Scotland, Thatcher presented and spoke and symbolised something that felt very alien. And remember, most people in Scotland had never voted for her, so there was a kind of sense of democratic alienation from that as well. But she was more than a symbol of what was happening. In so many ways, she was the instigator of what was happening. And Looking at it from the perspective and the distance that we now have, a lot of the economic disruption was inevitable. The profound changes in the economy would have, to a greater or lesser extent, happened whether or not Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister. I guess, and it's something that I was very mindful of in later years as First Minister about the climate transition. There was just a sense of leaving people to deal with the implications of that on their own. So people were chucked onto or this is how it felt. People were being, from the old industries, were losing their jobs, being chucked onto the economic scrap heap. There was no support to reskill, retrain, get into new jobs. There was just a very, very strong sense that she couldn't have cared less. And there was a similar sense in the sell-off of social housing, which my parents took advantage of, that, that was fine. She got people to buy their houses. And it was a aspiration in vain in many parts of Scotland that, it didn't get them to vote Tory. But when people found that they couldn't afford the mortgage, when the interest rates went up, or were faced with a repair bill, there was just a sense that she didn't care. And I think it was that much more than how she spoke or how she presented, or even the economic trends that were underway. It was just this sense of lack of care, lack of compassion, lack of any sense of, we're all in this together. And I suppose that was epitomised a bit later on with her "there's no such thing as society" comment, which I think more than anything else offended, if there is such a thing as a sense of what makes us Scottish here politically. That notion of society is very central to it. And I think that was something that just offended that very sense of who we were.
You said you define yourself as a socialist, and you said you were very tribal. Why was the Labour Party not appealing?
That is, in a sense, that is the key question of my formative years in politics. I had an English teacher at school who was a local Labour councillor. When he picked up on my interest in politics, he assumed I would join the Labour Party. I lived in a Labour constituency. Interestingly, the neighbouring constituency had a Tory MP at the time, but my constituency was David Lambie at the time, heavily Labour. And he actually brought into class one day a kind of form of some description, because he assumed I would join the Labour Party. So in that moment, there was a bit of rebellion, like, who the F does he think he is? Kind of like just assuming I'm going to join the Labour Party. But it was more fundamental than that. So in a nutshell, Thatcher was doing all of the stuff that I was so enraged about to my community, my country. Scotland voted Labour, but Labour was utterly powerless to do anything about it. She was doing all of this in spite of Scotland returning all of these Labour MPs. And that's where, through that sort of sense of democratic disconnect and democratic deficit, is where my support for independence came. It seemed to me that the only way we could ensure as a country that we didn't have the Margaret Thatchers of this world governing us, it wasn't vote Labour, because Scotland effectively did that anyway. It was only by becoming independent and choosing our own governments.
Nicola, there's just a little moment there. It's quite interesting, is when you sort of rebel against your teacher. Who does he think he is? Is that a bit of your personality, along with the introvert? There's a little bit of you that occasionally thinks, who do you think you are? I'm going to rebel.
Yeah, a bit of my personality that I was probably always a little bit kind of nervous about showing. But, if I go back to the anecdote earlier on about the careers advisor acting with horror when I said I wanted to be a lawyer, there's absolutely a bit of rebellion kicked in at that point. I'm going to show her. I'm going to absolutely go to uni to be a lawyer. And when my English teacher, assumed I was going to join Labour, there is no doubt. So there's always been that little bit of, I will show people what I can do. It's probably also been the bit of my personality that's been necessary to overcome the introversion and the imposter syndrome. I've had to channel that, but there's no doubt at all that that's the case. Going back to Alice's point about why not Labour, though, it was that sort of democratic deficit point, but it was also at a time when, regardless of what we might assess this like now, back then when I was 18 and Kinnock was taking the Labour Party to the right, the SNP was on a journey more to the, Alex Salmond was in the ascendancy, there was more of a sense of the SNP moving leftwards. And it just seemed to me that the SNP was more of a home for somebody of my political outlook than the Labour Party was, even although my next door neighbour at home at the time always used to refer to the SNP as bloody tartan Tories every time they were mentioned.
But that was very much the reputation, not least because it was part of the SNP MPs who helped to bring down Callaghan and ushered in Margaret.
We might argue over the precise kind of, characterisation of that. But yeah, it was.
And you backed Major on Maastricht.
And I talk about that in the book, actually.
You reminded me, yeah.
The rare occasions that I voted against Alec in a vote of confidence at an SNP executive meeting. But, the bringing down of the Callaghan government is obviously before my time in politics. But one of the points I make is that people of my generation in the SNP were still being tagged with that tartan Tory description so many years later, which is why the Maastricht vote I thought was such an own goal at the time. But the point I'm making is that although the SNP were still seen as this kind of tartan Tories, a bit ideology light, broad church if you're being charitable, it was on a journey to becoming much more firmly established on the left of politics. At the same time, Labour seemed to be going in the opposite direction. Rory is waving his hand vigorously in my eye line.
Yeah, no, I'd love, partly for international listeners, just for you to give us a little bit of a sense of how the SNP changed over time. So people may be aware that there were figures like Robert Cunningham Graham, who seemed to be more kind of traditional, romantic, Laird-like figures. And then the SNP went on a journey which seemed to take it away from Highland clans and kilts towards more of a social democratic message. But maybe that's not true. I mean, tell us about the 60s and 70s and what happened.
It's broadly true. I mean, I suspect, the 60s and 70s are kind of before my time, but I suspect the best way to describe it is that until the very late 70s into the 80s, the SNP really resisted being defined on the sort of political spectrum at all. It was a broad church of people of the left, people much more socially and economically conservative.
It's like the Lib Dems, totally opportunistic.
We were never, can I just absolutely refute the suggestion that the SNP's ever been like the Lib Dems?
You're left here, right there.
That's the most insulting thing you've ever said to me. Anyway, and what united the SNP was a belief in independence, but it had no particular sense of what an independent Scotland should look like. When I joined the SNP, it was still very much dominated by fishing, farming, interests of the North East. Gordon Wilson, very sort of socially conservative politician, somebody I was incredibly fond of, but probably quite far removed from where I was in my political outlook. He was still leader. What was called the 1979 group, which Alex Salmond had been part of, had tried to position the SNP much more firmly on the left, and they got expelled. But at the time I was joining, they were back in, the first election I campaigned in was when Alec became an MP. So that sort of group of people who were trying to position the SNP on the left was in the ascendancy.
So, I mean, obviously I'm a Scot with a deep romantic interest in Scottish history, but I'm a long way from being on the left of the Labour Party where you were coming from.
I have noticed, yeah.
So explain a little bit that evolution, because of course for me when I was young, my form of Scottish nationalism was very, very deeply rooted in history, soil. I was a kind of little mini Jacobite. What happened to that tradition? What happened to people like me whose sense of Scotland was very, very historical, very romantic?
I mean, there are still people like you, or maybe not quite like you, but sort of like you in Scotland. And I think in every Scot, and that's possibly an overstatement, but I'm going to stick with it just now. In every Scot, whether they support independence or not, there is that sense of patriotism and national identity and that sort of romantic sense of what Scotland has been historically and is today. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. But I think certainly over the 1980s, people who supported independence, Neil McCormick, the constitutional lawyer, former MEP, former president of the SNP, described it as kind of utilitarian versus existential nationalists. The group in the ascendancy back then, in the 70s, going into the 80s, was the existential nationalists, those who Scotland is a country, ergo we should be independent, and then joined by the utilitarian nationalists, which I would describe myself more as, which is independence is the route to a better Scotland, a more, socially and economically just and fair Scotland. And through the 80s, 90s, and certainly into the independence referendum, that's the sense of Scottish independence that really, took hold of the independence movement.
You wrote, when we get into the 1997 great day for the country, Labour win, and we bring in the Scotland Act, and you have the referendum, and away we go, and you get the Scottish Parliament. I was very interested. You said that you supported, you thought it was the right decision to have that referendum, because at the time we announced that, we were absolutely lacerated.
Yeah, probably including by me at the time.
Yeah. So I'm glad that with retrospect, with hindsight, you recognise the wisdom of that move. I was also very touched.
We can also talk about some of your decisions that I still think were profoundly wrong if you want, but we'll stick.
Yeah, sure.
We'll stick
let's
one.
wait for part 3 for that one. But I was also really touched by in fact, you've got some really interesting portraits of some of the other politicians in this story, but your analysis of Donald Dewar and of his speech on the day that the Parliament came into being. You said it's one of the finest speeches in Scottish history. I just wondered, looking back, whether you felt, as we did, the Scottish Parliament will probably just about be enough to hold off the rush to independence, or whether you saw it very much at the time as a step in the right direction for what you were trying to achieve.
I saw it very much as a step in the right direction of what we were trying to achieve. There were others in the SNP who thought it would absolutely quash support for independence, and that, what in the SNP was known as the gradualist fundamentalist divide, was quite deep in those days and still lingers in the SNP to some extent, although in the last couple of decades has been overshadowed. I mean, just take the point you've raised. At the time, we didn't just rail against the notion there should be a referendum before devolution. We remember there was a deep and probably at the time not completely unreasonable fear that when Labour won, when Blair became Prime Minister, they would just quietly try to ditch that. So there was a fear at the time that was the first step to ditching it altogether. In retrospect, it was absolutely the right decision because it cemented the democratic authority underpinning the Scottish Parliament, and that might not have felt that important for most of the lifetime of the Parliament. It feels much more important now when there are actually people who would quite like to see the Parliament abolished or stripped quite substantially of its powers. The first election to the Parliament, I think, was a difficult one for the SNP, and it probably, looking back, couldn't have been anything else. We were the party arguing that the Parliament should immediately go forward and become an independent Parliament before people had had any time to see the devolved Parliament in action. But I think, the sense or the hope or whatever on the part of you guys that it would be enough and support for independence would just wither on the vine, that certainly turned out not to be the case, because I think by and large, when people get a sense of self-government, and as long as they feel confident in that self-government, then I think it's a natural instinct to want more of it. And I think that's what kicked in as the early years of the Parliament developed.
Nicola, again, just to sort of step back and the bigger picture for people, could you just paint a picture of the kind of powers the Scottish Parliament got? What kind of devolution this was and how it would compare, I don't know, for an American listener or to someone in Europe, to the kind of federalism you might have elsewhere? What sort of powers did they get? What sort of more powers could they have got? What were the debates there?
So the powers the Parliament had was very substantial powers over education, local government, health, transport, economic developments, regional economic development, that kind of stuff. What the Parliament lacked and has a bit more of now, but in my view, it is still the fundamental imbalance in how devolution works, is it had very, very limited revenue-raising powers. So the referendum that Alastair and I have been talking about had two questions. Should there be a Parliament was the first question. The second question, should it have the ability to vary the basic rate of income tax by up to 3 pence in the pound? So that really was the only revenue-raising power the Parliament had, and it never used it in those days. Post the independence referendum, those powers were slightly enhanced.
My understanding is in the US, for example, if you're the governor of California, you have completely separate state taxes, separate from federal taxes. Is that a route which was considered? Why didn't we go down that route? What's the story in Britain that we didn't end up with that system?
You're probably better to ask Alastair that question than me, because it was Labour that designed the devolution settlement that was then voted on in that referendum.
We were rather hoping you'd dive straight into the trap of saying, yeah, we want to put up taxes. You didn't do that.
Well, of course, we did fight the 1999 election on the Penny for Scotland campaign of Gordon Brown had just cut income tax by a penny, and we said we'd restore it in order to raise revenue.
Yeah, we thought you might go with the full 3p.
We were never as daft as you thought we were.
But back to why we didn't end up with state and federal taxes.
I mean, that was a Labour decision. It is still, even though now the Scottish Parliament has pretty much complete responsibility for income tax, although there's a complicated reconciliation sort of model if we use those powers, there is still a real disconnect and imbalance between the spending powers of the Scottish Parliament and the revenue raising powers, which, independence would obviously resolve. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to people to decide. But certainly within devolution, there is still, I think, and would be scope to redress that balance with much greater powers. There has been a debate in Scotland for a long time. It was a debate post-independence referendum through the Smith Commission about whether corporation tax should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. But there's definitely a strong argument, even just in accountability terms, to get a better balance between spending and revenue raising.
And is the energy going more and more into really having that debate? Do we want a German system? Do we want a US system? What kind of federal system? Or is the problem that the SNP's been so focused on independence that the intellectual energy hasn't really gone into making that vision?
I mean, I would say this, but I don't think it would be fair to say that that is the case. There is absolutely no sense on the part of the current UK government and certainly the Tory government that preceded that government, there is no appetite to have that debate. You take it's not a tax issue, but the debate that is very live in Scotland and should be activating, I think, action on the part of the UK government is around migration powers. Scotland's demographics are such that the current fixation on cutting immigration in the UK is devastating to our economic prospects. It's devastating right now to the ability to fill jobs in public services. So if there was any genuine appetite to have a debate about where does power best lie between the different legislators in the UK, that would be a good place to start. There's no appetite for that. So even if the SNP was to say, okay, we'll park independence for a bit and try to have this debate, there's no sense that there's anybody on the other side of that debate willing to have it.
Nicola, the other thing that happened, of course, around the post-referendum and the establishment of the Parliament is you were elected for the first time. But the other thing I found really interesting in the book, it was fascinating to me how the imposter syndrome kind of seemed to deepen because you felt you weren't, as it were, properly elected. You got through not on the votes, but on the list system. I got the feeling that sort of hung over you absolutely up until the time where you were elected in your own right. Why did you take that so personally?
I think it was a confidence thing. In the Scottish Parliament, constituency MSPs and regional list MSPs are absolute equals. I mean, there's no difference in responsibilities or status, and that's as it should be. I am not arguing that being a regional list MSP is somehow inferior, but I think for me, and I don't know, I think possibly for any politician, if you have put yourself forward in a constituency in a first past the post election and you fail to get elected, there's always going to be a sense of personal failure in that. And then you find yourself in the Parliament through another route. And I think for anybody, but particularly somebody who struggled with confidence, who always had this sense of, am I good enough? I think that was always going to gnaw away at me, particularly since I went into that election, rightly or wrongly, as the favourite to win that constituency. So it felt that I had fallen short. I don't think I'd acquitted myself at all points very well in that election campaign. Suddenly the SNP had gone from, a minor party at Westminster into being a potential party of government in Scotland. The scrutiny on us was unlike anything we'd experienced before. Alec bore, the biggest brunt of that, but it affected all of us. And it definitely, at a time when I should have been coming out of my shell and blossoming, elected into Parliament for the first time, I seemed to go in the other direction. And then add in the sort of teething problems of the Parliament, all of the opprobrium that was chucked at the Parliament in the early days. And I developed a sense of, maybe the Parliament's not up to the task. And within that, maybe I'm just not up to the task.
Alex Salmond seems to be a very, very charismatic, dominating, important figure for national politics and also within your life. I mean, looking back on him, can you give a sort of rounded portrait for a younger generation that maybe weren't as familiar with him on what his strengths were, what his weaknesses were, who this guy was?
He's somebody who, in many respects, was the personification of charisma back then, this up-and-coming, very articulate, very media-friendly politician that also had a very clear vision of where the SNP should be positioning itself, how we should be fighting elections, how we should be trying to progress the case for independence. And for people of my political outlook, he was absolutely the person to follow and to rally behind. He was brilliant in so many ways, tactically, maybe less so strategically, but tactically on a day-to-day basis, brilliant. He could dominate political debate on screen, off screen. There was a magnetism. Being around him was intoxicating. It was, he brought rooms alive. And he was good at what he did in so many respects. The SNP would not have got into government in 2007 without Alex Salmond. But there was a darker side to that as well. He could be really, really hard to work with and for. He didn't do it to me for some reason. But I saw him do it to lots of people, the hairdryer treatment, the, borderline humiliating people that displeased him. And so it was definitely a two sides of the coin thing. But for a long part of my career, the upsides seemed to massively outweigh the downsides.
Give us an example of tactical brilliance, just one anecdote or something, sort of bring him alive, something where you watched him do something where you thought, wow, that really is a very nimble, able politician.
When we were first elected to government in 2007, the Scottish governments at that time were called the Scottish Executive. There was a sense in the early days of devolution that actually contributed to this kind of disconnect between the public and its government, because what was an executive, it was abstract, it didn't mean anything. We decided that we would, and this later was done legally, but at the time we would just rebrand the Scottish Executive as the Scottish Government. And literally, he decided overnight. We didn't tell anybody. Overnight, every Scottish executive building in the country was suddenly rebranded the Scottish Government. So in a stroke, the country suddenly, like today, that would be seen as a waste of money and just, a vanity project. But back then, overnight, the country stood a bit taller. It suddenly had a government of its own. It also absolutely illustrated in people's minds the change from what had gone before in the Labour Liberal executive and the SNP government now. And that was the kind of thing he was the master of. That sort of brilliant, using often symbolism or imagery to create and perpetuate a public mood. And that was a Salmond masterstroke.
Lest we start to think that this is a sort of paean of praise to Alex Salmond, I'll just give you a few lines from the book. In any leader, the line between brilliance and stupidity can be a very fine one. We can come back to that. And then we do want to talk about your time as First Minister. We want to talk about the Brexit referendum, about the Scottish independence referendum. And then, of course, it does get very dark with Alex, not least because of the sex allegations and signing up with Russia Today. But you ended up saying he would rather have destroyed the SNP than succeed without him. I had to face the fact he was determined to destroy me. His claims of conspiracy and betrayal were the cries of a man not prepared to look at himself honestly in the mirror. Just before we go back into that, maybe just take us a step back to the independence referendum. You were telling Rory about where you felt Salmond was good tactically. My big worry, as somebody who was on the other side of the argument to you, was actually I got the sense that Salmond ran rings around Cameron in terms of framing the whole thing, 16 and 17-year-old votes, the question, the timing of the question. That was an example to me of his pretty effective tactical operations.
And can I do a very, very quick explainer for international listeners? So we're now coming into 2014.
Yeah.
The SNP has been pushing hard for independence, obviously from the creation of the party, but particularly since the creation of the Scottish Government. And David Cameron takes what for many of us, I was then in the Parliament in Westminster, seemed like an enormous risk, which was to agree that there would be a referendum. And this time, the referendum would have allowed Scotland to go independent if it got a majority in that vote, whereas the votes in the 1970s had required a higher bar to cross for independence. And it felt like a very, very close thing. And it felt, as Alastair says, as though Alex Salmond was very clever in setting the terms of this referendum, which felt as though it was continually disadvantaging the unionist side, right? That's my little explainer, which, Nicola, you'll probably disagree with my explainer. Anyway, over to you for an answer.
I don't disagree with that. I don't think it's the whole story of the referendum. If we go back to David Cameron's, decision to say yes to a referendum, which would take away any legal wrangling over whether the Scottish Parliament did or did not have power to do it unilaterally. In that moment, and that was the moment David Cameron took us a little bit by surprise. We hadn't expected him to do that when he did it. So we briefly were on the back foot and suddenly thought, because at that point we didn't know whether he was going to say you can have a referendum, but you have to have it in 3 months' time. And so suddenly we thought, oh my goodness, we're not ready for this. And yet we might be about to be rushed towards the point of decision. But we quickly regrouped. And Alec was always really good in these moments. And, through different, devices, we kind of wrested the initiative back, got into a process of negotiation, which from sort of late 2012, I was in charge of with Michael Moore on the other side of the debate that led to the Edinburgh Agreement. And in the Edinburgh Agreement, we effectively, in terms of the process of the referendum, we kind of got everything we wanted. We got to set the date, subject to Electoral Commission approval. We got to set the question. We were allowed, we won the argument over votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. So in terms of how that was then shaping up in process terms, we were delighted with how that was. I think, to move on from process to substance, we were always at a disadvantage. There was a sort of institutional, and I guess it might always be this when you've got a battle between the status quo and, an argument for big change, that the status quo's always got a bit of an advantage because it's the devil. People know whether or not they like it or not, they know it. Whereas people who are arguing for change, as we were, are always kind of having to get people to sort of accept the unknown and the unprovable in things. There was definitely a sense, and this was through UK government, I would say through, the BBC and a lot of the British media, that anything David Cameron or the President of the European Commission or the President of the United States said was taken as gospel. Anything we said was assertion and, couldn't be trusted. So there was an institutional imbalance there, in light of which the fact that we came as close is probably actually a bit of a triumph.
You do admit, though, in the book, Nicola, that you feel that you were weak on the issues of currency, what would happen to the pound, weak on defence, weak on nuclear weapons. And it struck me as odd. Yes, I get it. Cameron threw down the gauntlet, took you by surprise. But I was genuinely surprised, both at the time and now reading your book, that you hadn't done more work on those questions. And are they not the questions that are going to haunt you again if another referendum comes?
Can I just quickly come in on the back of this? Because I don't know whether you remember, Nicola, but you very kindly came in front of my parliamentary committee in 2014 where I was grilling you on foreign affairs, defence, security. And I remember this quite long, I think it was in the assembly rooms in Edinburgh, but a very, very long session where you were having to try to answer questions on exactly how many embassies Scotland was going to have abroad, how much funding you'd put into your intelligence services, etc.
Let me try and, as candidly as possible, answer this. I think at the outset, when the referendum debate went from being kind of almost hypothetical, big picture into, well, there's definitely going to be a referendum. So the level of scrutiny and the granularity of scrutiny went up several gears. We were playing catch up, I think, in this sort of preparation on some of these big questions. I think we got ourselves into a much stronger place, but that stronger place was always going to be a difficult place to argue what were essentially in advance unprovable things. Scotland will keep the pound. Now, I will argue to my dying day that had there been a yes vote in the referendum, there would have been an accommodation around a currency union. Now, what the price of that might have been for an independent Scotland is up for debate, but I believe there would have been. I also believe an independent Scotland would have been able to negotiate independent membership of the European Union. But convincing people of that in advance was always going to be really difficult. Add into that the sense of, the referendum was effectively a choice between, what will happen on take EU membership. It should have been a debate about what will happen to EU membership if we stay in the UK versus what will happen if we vote for independence. Instead, it was all of, what would happen if we stayed in the UK was treated as neutral and benign, and all the risk was on the independence side. Now, in retrospect, you can see how unfair that was, because on EU membership, it was actually rejecting independence that ended up with us out of the EU, not the opposite. So there was just a structural imbalance in the debate. Now, maybe inevitably, maybe it can't be any other way. And I think, given that, although, the outcome was devastating for people like me, in some ways, when you think about it in those terms, that we got so close to a different outcome is actually remarkable, and a tribute to the strength, not of the political leadership necessarily, but of that grassroots democratic awakening in Scotland that blossomed over that summer into referendum day.
I was passionately on the union side and remain very much on the union side, but I felt another challenge that you had is that nationalism was beginning to develop a bad name, because this is the beginning of the rise of populism. This is the beginning of the rise of right-wing nationalist parties in parts of Europe. And so an independence referendum, which was about dividing people, making a country smaller, saying us and them, could always be characterized by people like me in terms of what people don't like about nationalism. And of course, you had a very different vision of nationalism, didn't you? You had a vision of civic nationalism, which wasn't really like that. But were you conscious of that problem, that nationalism was beginning to develop in a broader global context, a more difficult name, even if your type of nationalism wasn't like that?
So I think that's something we, and certainly I, have always been conscious of. I don't think that became a bigger issue in the referendum campaign. I think had the referendum been a year later, that would have been different. But I think at that point, it wasn't really. But that was something that had always been a worry, because the Scottish independence movement, the SNP, is not a nationalist party in the sense that you have described and that we see in many parts of the world today. And of course, in many of these countries, these nationalist parties are not, they're not fighting independence campaigns. It's about a vision of the country that is. Ours is a civic movement. It's about self-government. It's in the context of this debate, ironic that the SNP is probably the most pro-immigration party in the UK. I think I say that without fear of contradiction. We wanted Scotland to remain in the European Union. So the nationalist movement in Scotland is not just civic in the sense of it doesn't matter where you come from. If you live in Scotland, you have a stake in our country, but it is deeply internationalist in terms of independence is, yes, about making Scotland a better place domestically, but it's also about Scotland playing a bigger role in the world. So that's always been something that we fought to define and to avoid some of the more negative connotations of nationalism globally. I've said before, and I would say again, if I could go back to the founding of the SNP, I wouldn't call it the Scottish National Party, because I think that name conjures up some of that stuff that is not justified, but can't do that, obviously. But I don't think that was a huge issue in the referendum campaign. I think and I'll just speak personally here, I think what I didn't take enough account of was the kind of emotional impact on the part of people who opposed independence, of this sense that it was part of their identity that they were at risk of losing. And I look back and feel a bit ashamed that I didn't pay enough attention to that, not in the sense of changing my mind, but being more sensitive to that. And it wasn't until Brexit, ironically, when I felt a part of my identity, European identity, was being taken away, that I really understood that. And that was my deficiency, I think, looking back.
It's really interesting you say that about the name. I can give you the exact date, March the 14th, 2014. The reason I know that's the date It's the day that Tony Benn died. And I was in Aberdeen with Alex Salmond doing an interview for GQ, where, if you remember, he said some silly things about Vladimir Putin.
I remember this interview well.
What did he say? Tell us what he said.
He basically talked about how he admired Putin, and whatever he said about Putin is a strong leader. And it went it was massive in Scottish politics for days and days and days and days. We had this very long interview, and then we had dinner. And he said to me, if we get independence, by the way, I'd like to get some of you kind of Anglo-Scots involved in the sort of process of transition, blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, I think to get independence, the first thing you should do, you should change the name of your party. I think you should get rid of national and make it about internationalism as well as independence. But anyway, that never happened. The other thing that came through in your account of the referendum campaign, you became what became known as the Yes Minister. Your job essentially became winning the argument for independence and also for doing the kind of the big draft white paper. And there's a very interesting account of Alex phoning you from Hong Kong. Sounds like he's a bit the worse for wear. And you are reduced to tears by the fact that you seem to be carrying all the weight of the work that you're doing, and you have what feels to me like a pretty bad panic attack. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the first time in my life I remember having what I would describe as a genuine panic attack. It was, just a matter of weeks before the white paper had to go to print. The white paper, and I would say this, I think we did a really good job in the white paper. Whatever people think about, the content of it, I think we put out there something that was a pretty weighty prospectus for how independence could be achieved and what it would deliver.
It was bloody long, I remember that.
It was very long, but it was trying to do so many things in the same document. It was a really, really tough task to get it from conception through to publication. I had a big team working with me in the civil service, but I was very personally invested in it. I was reading every draft myself, kind of rewriting bits of it myself. And by the end of this process, it took hours and hours and hours just to read it from start to finish. And I reached this point where I had this sense of impossibility. I can't get it from where it is just now to where it needs to be. And it goes to print in a few weeks. And I remember, sort of ended up on the floor of the room I'm in right now, actually crying and struggling to breathe. And it was just this weight of responsibility of having to get this document that I felt, and I think to some extent this proved to be the case, would be really pivotal in how the rest of the campaign would unfold. And Alec at that point, he was First Minister, so maybe this was justified. He was, running the country, but he wasn't taking much to do with the white paper. Alec didn't really properly engage in the referendum campaign till probably after the Commonwealth Games that summer, so quite late summer. I knew I had to get him to he was the person who had to effectively sign it off before it went to print. He hadn't read it. I knew I had to get him to read it. And just at the point of knowing that I was going to have to force this, he told me he was off on a trade mission to China. And I'm like, how on earth am I meant to get him to read this thing when he's pissing off to China? And he said, I'll read it on the plane, Nicola. And I'm like, yeah, until you have the first glass of in-flight champagne. And then we were faxing copies of this to China. I'm like, he's probably under covert surveillance.
That was sensible.
I know, but we had no choice.
So the Chinese knew before we did what was going on.
They probably did. But it was, looking back. But anyway, the sort of the low point of this was because as well as I was having to stand in for him at First Minister's questions. On this particular day, the MOD had done a big announcement around shipbuilding, which was actually about reducing shipbuilding in Scotland, but it turned out to be more of a problem for the Yes campaign than the No campaign. My constituency interests meant, I knew a lot about shipbuilding. There had been a shipyard in my constituency for much of my time in Parliament. So I'm getting ready to go down to the chamber to do First Minister's questions for Alec, and the phone rings and it's Alec. He'd spent the afternoon at horse racing in Hong Kong. He was not sober and he just phoned helpfully to give me a few tips for First Minister's questions. I think I told him to F off and put the phone down.
And yet, you see, this is the other thing that's interesting. You admitted that, because I remember at the time seeing you and some of your people and we've got this button down, we've got that button down.
Oh, we did. I mean, we did, but what was going on behind the scenes was much, much tougher.
I'm glad you admitted in the book that, and I'm really pleased about this because I was involved on the other side in this one, that Alastair Darling wiped the floor, that's your phrase, wiped the floor with him in the first debate. And you were then, and you describe yourself in the spin room, saying how well Alex did while crying inside. Haven't you thereby exposed the utter pointlessness of these spin rooms?
They're utterly pointless. I'm not an advocate of spin rooms. I've not, because more of my experience has been doing the debates rather than being in the spin room of the debates. But, I've been in a spin room at debates probably less than a handful of times. This was the most miserable experience I had ever had in one. And it was that sense of, I thought in that moment we had blown the whole thing, because at that point it was still an uphill struggle, but there was a growing sense of possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could pull this off. And in that moment, it felt we'd blown the whole thing. It didn't turn out to be the case. The polls didn't, show a hemorrhaging of yes support. But, that was just it's a moment in the referendum campaign, a period I will never, and I don't have the opportunity now to work out what was going on, but I wasn't allowed to take part in any of his debate preparation. I'd been doing most of the debates by this point, and I thought, well, I've got a good sense of what's coming at us, what works best but I was frozen out for reasons that I didn't understand at the time and don't understand to this day. But there you go. That is all history.
It's so refreshing to be able to talk honestly about these things now that everybody's left politics. But I just wondered, sort of going behind the scenes, what it felt like to be on the other side. So if I think back to, as I say, you may not remember it very well, but we had you in Edinburgh in front of our committee, and I was asking grumpy questions about the intelligence service. And Frank Roy, who, for listeners, was a long-standing member of parliament in Motherwell, who'd been a steel worker in a Scottish plant, and Ming Campbell, who was on the committee with me, who'd been a sort of Scottish national legend as an athlete. And then later you get much bigger guns like Gordon Brown making these kind of big speeches. What was your sort of sense of this? Did you feel that people were being unfair? Did you feel that these were biased unionists? Did you feel these were men patronizing you? I mean, what was your emotional experience of these kinds of encounters?
So I felt, it was a David and Goliath situation, and we were the underdogs. We were, the kind of upstarts against the whole weight of the British establishment. And of course, there were other voices from outside Britain weighed in. President of the Commission, Obama, opines at some point. So we felt absolutely that we had this, massive weight, establishment weight against us. There was also a sense that they were every fear and smear. So it wasn't on the no side that debate, the issues were being debated in a sort of proper, realistic sense. It was a fear campaign. And, the No campaign referred to itself as Project Fear. So, and you talk about Gordon Brown's big speeches, and he made some very influential speeches in the course of that. I'm not knocking Gordon here, but he was one of the voices that decided to argue the case that people in Scotland would not be able to watch Doctor Who if we voted for independence. So there was a sense of just trying to scare people.
I think it was EastEnders.
Well, that makes it okay then, Alison. I take it all back. It was EastEnders instead of Doctor Who. I'm not sure that is the germane point at the heart of this debate, but anyway. So there was, and you won't get to use the pound, you'll get chucked out of the European, and actually that started to play in our favour, because people started to feel insulted, that intelligence and sense of self was being insulted, and there started to be a sense of, well, if in the UK we have no rights to shared assets, we have no right to determine our own future, then actually, what good is this union doing us? So it played in our favour, and we reached a point, I think, where once people decided to vote yes, there was no shifting them. So Alex, the first debate performance, where in the moment I thought this is going to be disastrous, people are going to, hemorrhage away from yes. That didn't happen. People were solid once they made that decision. I think what we didn't do effectively enough, obviously, because we lost, and things like the debate performance just not being able to be convincing enough because we were trying to prove the unprovable on the big issues, we didn't get enough or a fast enough momentum from the soft no to yeses. We got some of the way, but we didn't get quite there. And that was partly our own feeling, but partly it was because of that weight of, the sky will fall in if Scotland votes to be independent. So the final week of the campaign, the banks all, I think, probably under significant pressure from the Treasury, were all pressed to come out and say, we'll leave Scotland if there's a yes vote. So that weight of everything being against us was definitely felt emotionally and practically. But in some way, as an underdog often will, it allowed us to really rally and rally our troops as well.
Yeah, and also then Project Fear in the Brexit campaign backfired badly. So they didn't really, Cameron and Osborne read the lessons of winning rather than the lessons of what went well and what didn't.
In the hours after the result in 2014, Cameron's pronouncements on the doorstep of Number 10 about English votes for English laws, that was, from our perspective, brilliant and it helped fuel that post-referendum sense of Scotland's not being put back in its box. But from Cameron's point of view, the most tone-deaf speech in a crowded field, the most tone-deaf speech I've ever heard. It sounded as if he was punishing Scotland for daring to dream, as opposed to saying, OK, we've heard that you might not think the union is working great for you. How do we make it better?
You said in the book that you had an inflated sense of optimism ahead of polling day. And as the campaigning finished, you said, this is in the book, when I got home to Glasgow, I had a glass of wine and cried. There's quite a lot of tears in this book, Nicola.
I'm one of life's criers, which is it's one of the things people probably don't think about.
Right.
Following on from the first referendum, the time I was most scared, to be honest, is when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And we came into 2020, and I and many of my Conservative colleagues in Scotland felt, this is it. We're in real trouble. Because we've got a Tory government, we've got Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, who was horrendously unpopular in Scotland. We'd had Brexit that Scotland had voted against. We had a massive, large, motivated SNP base. You, as First Minister, were riding higher than any First Minister in history. It seemed at that point that there was no way of avoiding a referendum and that you were very probably going to win. And then it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Why didn't you get it across the line the second time?
If we had secured a referendum, we would have won that referendum. And that can't be disproved because it didn't happen. But I believe with every fibre of my being, that would have been the case. And therein lies the answer to the question, why did we not secure a referendum? Because Westminster just decided it wasn't going to let it happen.
Just to interrupt, because again, to bring people back to that, certainly the view of Scottish Tories was that Westminster wouldn't be able to prevent it. And our advice to Boris Johnson, which turned out to be wrong from the unionist point of view, was you're going to have to grant a referendum. You can't have a situation where Westminster refuses to grant. And
I think ultimately that will prove to be the case. I don't think in any democracy people can be prevented forever from making a choice that enough people want to make. But in that moment, and this was a question that had never been definitively answered, could the Scottish Parliament have done it unilaterally, or did it legally need, Westminster to exercise the power or transfer the power? That has now been, answered through the Supreme Court, which actually in some ways is better for the independence movement because we've got a sense of reality rather than delusion about what is possible, and we know that we have to build the case and strengthen the pressure for a referendum for that to happen. But in that moment, I think it was easy for the Tories just to say no. What was the price of that? There wasn't much of a price to be paid. They could play into the sense that they had created of, well, there's chaos around Brexit, so we don't want to add to that at the moment. And then of course COVID comes along and there's a sense that, for that reason, it's not the time to do this. So they found that politically they were able just to say no. Now, I don't think that will sustain forever. The task for my party and those on my side of the argument is to sooner rather than later get to a point where that position for any Westminster government is politically unsustainable.
And looking back, do you think there might have been a couple of things you could have done differently, that you could have gambled more, used that incredible momentum and position you had in a slightly different way to get it across the line?
In short, yes, there must have been things I could have done differently because I gambled more. The thing is, I don't know what that means. And I've searched my soul over what that means. Gambling more would have been to say, right, I don't care what you say, Theresa May or Boris Johnson, I'm going to start the process of legislating for an independence referendum. I think I would have struggled to get that past my law officers at the time because of the legal position. But say I had managed to do it, would have ended up in court because it would have been challenged. And we would have got to where we got to with the Supreme Court anyway. So gambling more, yeah, it might have made people feel better in the moment. Would it have actually delivered a different outcome? I think that is a much more open question. You know, we have a fundamental issue that we have to reckon with, which is the Scotland Act reserves the Constitution and with it the determination of whether or not there's going to be a referendum to Westminster governments. Now, my party had got into the point of believing is, well, actually, if I was just braver, if I was just, you know, more able to sort of give two fingers to Westminster, that would change. Well, we couldn't just magic that away. We can't just magic that away. What we've got to do is shift the political balance of advantage and disadvantage. We have to not just get to the point where a majority of people in Scotland clearly want independence, but they want it badly and urgently enough that there is a sense that Westminster can't stand in the way of that. And that sounds like, you know, long, hard work. And it is hard work, and how long it is depends on how well we do it. But there's no magicking it away. And I wish there was. I wish there was some other way I could have found to get round the legal reality. But I'm not sure there is a way to get round. In fact, I'm pretty certain there's not.
You were there almost a decade. You dealt with 5 British Conservative Prime Ministers. You dispense with Liz Truss in about a third of a sentence. So we don't need to waste too much time on that. I get the feeling, just tell me if this is right, you quite liked Cameron. You had a lot of respect for Theresa May, but you couldn't really build a rapport. You thought Rishi Sunak was a little bit out of touch, and you thought Boris Johnson was a complete and total charlatan. Does that about sum it up?
I think it's a reasonable summary. Cameron was the one I got on easiest with. And I think that was partly the kind of Eton charms of, and yeah, I quite liked him. We had our moments of we disagreed in a lot, but we had some moments of shouting at each other and such like. But I always got on well with him. Theresa was undoubtedly, of the 5 prime ministers I interacted with, the one that seemed to me to take the job most seriously. You know, was always on top of our brief, knew what she was about, and she would say the same about me maybe, so it's not all one way. It was just impossible to build a rapport, and that frustrated me at times because I instinctively thought her and I should have been able to build a better rapport, and undoubtedly my feeling is much as hers, but it wasn't possible. Rishi, I didn't really have much to do with Rishi because I stood down not long after he became Prime Minister. Liz Truss, well, we know what happened with Liz Truss. Boris, you know, a message, something emerged during the COVID inquiry where I had, in a message to one of my advisors, called him an effing clown. I mean, it wasn't the most polite way of describing somebody, but he's a clown, a charlatan, somebody who should never in a month of Sundays been anywhere near Downing Street. And there was nothing about how Boris approached the job that said he took it remotely seriously. Everything for him was reduced to an opportunity for a gag. And that basically was my experience of him. And yeah, I don't know, maybe some people have got different experiences, but that was mine.
Given all that, and that's a pretty strong statement, how on earth did he manage to become Prime Minister? I mean, what does it tell us about British politics? I mean, because everything you've described would suggest that British public, who basically, and we believe in democracy and have a certain amount of common sense, would never vote for someone like that. So what does it tell you about the world that someone like that can become Prime Minister?
In Scotland, of course, we didn't vote for, I mean, obviously some people did, but in Scotland, we didn't vote for him. I think, you know, why is Trump president? I think for progressives, people on the left of politics, I think there's some really big questions that we have to ask ourselves that there are, and arguably I was able to do this from a very different political perspective than these guys, of kind of just tune into the kind of sense of a population and make them feel, and in my case, I hope it was genuine, that you're kind of one of them and on their side and there's a sort of authentic connection. But people like Boris and Trump are doing that. And how are they doing that? We have to ask ourselves that, because they are in many ways, you know, both Boris and Donald Trump are the polar opposite of being, of the people that are voting for them. In many ways are the examples of the problems of the financial and economic elites that have done so much damage. But I think there is a straight, and I always tried as a leader to speak, straightforwardly. It's what I tried to do during COVID. People could agree or disagree with me, but I tried to kind of communicate clearly and directly. And I think they do that as well. And I think there is something, if you listen to the likes of, and I don't want to single out Keir Starmer and have a go at him gratuitously here, but you listen to people like Keir Starmer and you get to the end of his sentence and think, what was he saying? What was he trying to say? Because it's all buzzwords and political jargon and it's all mangled up a bit. And so I think there is, and obviously the problems of the world right now are much more than communication, but I think politicians on the left, they're trying to ape the Trumps and the Johnsons of this world rather than offer an alternative. And then even when they're trying to offer an alternative, they're not able to communicate it in a way that people are able to relate to and connect with.
Your publisher must have been delighted, though, that Trump had a little whack at you as he left Turnberry Golf Club the last time he was there.
Well, I was quite delighted.
I suspect he'll be on the paperback cover. Yeah. Back to your point about you love Alan Johnson. I'm with you on that one.
I'm with you on that too, and I agree with you on Boris as well.
We both, most of our listeners, in fact, I'm very shocked that both of you have called him Boris. You must never call him Boris. Jim Murphy, you can't stand. You like Mark Dreyfus and Carwyn Jones. Very fond of Martin McGuinness. I think we've got to give you a little shout out for your analysis of Nigel Farage. While I found him every bit as odious in person as he appears on TV, it also seemed to me that underneath the bombast is a brittle, fragile ego. He seems very insecure, especially around women. And then you've got lots of interesting observations about sexism and misogyny throughout the book. And maybe this is a way back into Alex Salmond before we kind of get towards the end of this.
I mean, it's so ingrained and embedded that women, or maybe everybody, but certainly speaking for myself, you don't always recognise it as sexism, misogyny, because it's you kind of internalise it. It's just how the world is. And I tell a story in the book about a kind of episode that I suffered from an MSP of another party in the early days of the Scottish Parliament of effectively sexual bullying. But it took me until 2017, in the wake of Me Too, when the Scottish Parliament was doing a survey of staff and members, it took me till then to actually recognise what that had been. Back at the time, I just thought, well, that's what you have to put up with in politics, because that's it's rough and tumble. That's how it is.
Are we allowed to tell the story, or would you rather we didn't?
I don't mind. You can tell it, though. I still feel mortified by it.
So basically, this is a guy who spread the rumour that Nicola had injured a boyfriend whilst performing oral sex and gave her the nickname Nasha.
I don't know whether he started the rumour or gave me the nickname.
Well, he certainly spread it.
I don't know whether he was the source of it, but he took great delight in spreading it.
Yeah. And then you also had this situation with a very good friend of mine who I've known since way back when I was doing my job with Tony and she was doing the same job with Chirac, and that's Catherine Colonna, who was then became ambassador to the UK. And this rumour spread. And you seem to indicate you think this may have been the Russians, that you and she were involved in this lesbian relationship.
I don't know. I've often wondered, because there was an episode I won't go into just now in the 2015 election of a story that came out of a discussion between me and a French ambassador, a different French ambassador. And I just often wondered, is this some kind of bot factory that's taken all these little ingredients and thrown up the story that had no basis in fact at all, that Catherine and I were having this relationship. It involved at one point the suggestion we'd bought a house from Judy Murray and we were living in there. And people, if that had just been a social media rumour, I probably would never have heard of it. My family were being asked about it. My neighbours were, asking about it. But going back to misogyny and sexism, I mean, that's undoubtedly an aspect of that. Women in politics are treated differently to men in almost every respect. The focus on what we wear, how we look, the tone of our voice, things in men that are seen as attributes of leadership, and in women, their character flaws. And that different treatment was true when I was growing up in politics. It is still true today. And then you add in the factor of social media and the toxicity of social media. And I think while there are more women in politics today, I think the the sense of public life being a bit of a hostile environment for women is actually greater today than it was in my earlier days in politics.
Can I bring together your point about the age of Trump and your points about women and sexism? You were a real champion of some of the big progressive causes of the 2000s. I mean, you really defined yourself around issues like climate justice, immigration, and you were a big campaigner for trans rights. And these are things which now in the age of Trump feel a bit sort of abandoned. I mean, you'll get even friends of Alastair on the left saying the Democratic Party could have won if it hadn't lent so hard into those issues, and that actually what they need to do is move away from those issues, become more relevant to everyday voters, right? And that often means the progressive left basically not talking very much about climate, not talking about immigration, not talking about trans issues. What's your reflection on that? And do you sometimes fear that your form of progressivism, a bit like, I guess, my anxieties about my form of centrism, is being a bit kind of sidelined and left behind by bigger historical trends?
I absolutely fear that. I think that's, you boil everything down. And my biggest worry about the state of democracy, the state of humanity right now, is that these issues that I think are so vital, the planet is burning. I'm sitting here in Glasgow in early August and we've got an amber warning for wind and rain. The planet, the climate change is happening right now. There are parts of the world that are becoming uninhabitable because of climate change. And yet we seem to have slipped into this belief, or large parts of the populations of the world have slipped into this belief that it's the action to tackle climate change that is impoverishing people, not climate change itself. And similarly on, equality issues, we've slipped into the sense that, the problems that a working class man is facing economically are, is all down to women's rights or gay rights or trans rights. And that is fine in terms of there are people in this world who want to argue these things because that's what they want to believe. My real despair, and at times right now it is despair, is that people on the progressive left or centre left of politics are just abandoning that territory. So for me, it's not that the Democrats in America or Labour or the SNP in a UK sense should be abandoning these issues to focus on issues more relevant to people. The challenge is to show people why these issues are so relevant to their living standards and to the health of the community that they happen to be living in. And instead, you take immigration. I deplore the way in which Starmer is effectively abandoning this argument to Farage. I think it's electorally stupid, because if you say to people, well, Farage is actually right, then I suspect they're going to vote for the real thing rather than the person that is seen to be playing catch up. In Scotland right now, one of the biggest economic challenges we face is a population that is not big enough for all the things we need to do. We need immigration. So I just want to see progressive politicians have the guts to stand up and argue the case on some of these things. It might be electorally uncomfortable for a period because these things tend to go in historical cycles. But if you abandon the ground and cede the argument to your opponents, as I think is happening too much just now, then frankly, I think we're all in a pretty sticky wicket on some of this stuff.
Yeah, you're right there about, you say you feel despair at the timidity of politicians on the left in the face of charlatans stoking fear or destroying democracy. I think I got a very strong sense of who you were pointing that one towards. Just my final point on Alex Salmond, and this relates to the discussion we just had on women in politics. When the scandal around the sexual misconduct allegations around him, was that the first time that you knew or sensed that there were real problems in this area concerning Salmond? Yeah,
and I've really searched my soul in this over the years since of, should I have known? Was I willfully blind to this? But I didn't know that there was any sense of inappropriate sexual behaviour. I've spoken openly about, what would be described as sometimes bullying behaviour. I'd heard rumours over the years about consensual affairs and always took the view, rightly or wrongly, that was none of my business. What consenting adults get up to is up to them. But no, until, all of this came to light, I did not think, or I certainly did not know, and I didn't think he was somebody that acted inappropriately around women. And again, going back to the whole issue of women being treated differently, there were times, and I don't want to overstate this, but there were times around that whole period where I thought I was getting more grief and being, sort of scrutinised more for what I knew when than he was for what he was actually alleged to have done.
Yeah. And there's another observation I want to make about Sam, which relates to your husband, Peter, because Rory made the point, I think we both made the point at different times as that whole story was unfolding, that was it a bit odd that the chief executive was married to the leader? And you actually record that Salmond said to you at the time, you should maybe think about getting rid of Peter as chief executive. I mean, looking back, whatever his motivations, which may have been related to something completely different, looking back, do you not think that would have been a wise thing to do?
I think I say in the book, and I'm being careful in what I say, and I'm going to be careful here for obvious reasons, because getting anywhere into the rights and wrongs substantively on this issue would take all of us into legal waters that we're not able to get into. So if I even put a toe into the substance of this, then that's a problem. I can see why people think that, is what I've said in the book, and I think that's probably as far as it's safe for me to go at the moment.
Nicola, one thing that we see consistently through your career and through this interview is that you're passionate about women and the interests of women. Again, for international listeners, one of the challenges that you faced was a challenge from some women over the transgender issue. There was this moment where you said that some of the people opposing the SNP's gender reform bill cloak themselves in women's rights to make it acceptable, but just as they're transphobic, you'll also find they're deeply misogynist, often homophobic, possibly some of them racist as well. What's going on there? I mean, that seems quite extreme.
I find it astonishing that anybody would take issue with that statement. Now, because literally everything I say on this issue is misrepresented and twisted in some way. I am not saying, and I've never said, that everybody who opposes trans rights or the gender recognition legislation that I took through Parliament falls into that category. Not by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm sorry, I think whatever side of this debate you're on, it is a simple statement of fact that there are many people who have attached themselves to this debate. People who would, support Trump or in America or Farage here, being opposed to trans rights is at the moment the acceptable form of bigotry. And if you scratch the surface of that, you'll find that these people are also homophobic and sexist and misogynist and maybe racist as well. Even people who fundamentally disagree with me on this issue, I genuinely can't believe that they don't recognise that.
And how is it? I mean, it's been one of the biggest bits of culture, well, almost more in Britain, actually, than in the US, strangely, because in the US, the progressive left doesn't have a group of feminists opposed to trans rights. It's not really a political phenomenon. What do you think it says about Scotland in particular that almost uniquely in the developed world, people who traditionally would have been on the feminist progressive left have taken such a strong position on this?
Well, some of them have. I've got many friends and colleagues on the feminist progressive left who are of that view. I'm not going to deny that, but I've got many who are not of that view. So I think and fair play to any campaign that manages to make people believe they are the overwhelming majority representation of an issue. I think with the help of media along the way, I think they've managed to do that. It's an interesting thing, when we first, or the issue of gender recognition reform was first mooted in Scotland, it was back in the 2016 Scottish election. And at that point, every party was committed to it. So it was myself for the SNP, Ruth Davidson for the Tories, Kes Dugdale for Labour, Willie Rennie for the Liberals. We were all at a hustings in that election campaign. The question was asked, are we all committed to it? And all of us, in one form or another, had a commitment to reform in our manifestos at that election. And also, we were not doing something groundbreaking or not proposing something groundbreaking. Many other countries had already done this. The Republic of Ireland has had this on the statute book for a long time. And that sense of consensus, no great controversy around this, continued right up until, 2021, 2022, at which point it became mired in the culture war. Now, part of that was that many people had concerns that they genuinely hold, and I do not take away from that. But there was also a sense that it was being whipped up from certain quarters as part of that bigger culture war. I believe that trans people should be respected and protected. There've always been trans people, there always will be. We should try to take away the discrimination and the stigmatization, afford greater dignity and respect. I'm a feminist to my core and always have been and always will be. The risk to women comes from abusive men. In any group, and I'm talking to the trans group here, you'll find bad faith people, bad people. There are some biologically born women who abuse children. In no other group do we say the bad people should define the rights of the whole group, which seems to me what we started to do with trans people. So I believe the rights of trans people and the rights of women are not in conflict and shouldn't be in conflict. If I have an overarching regret about this, is not that I believe something I shouldn't have believed or should have changed my mind. I'll fight for the rights of minorities for as long as I've got breath in my body. It's when this became so toxic. And I don't know that this would have made a difference, incidentally, but if I could have my time again, I think I would have pressed the pause button and said, okay, let's all take a breath, take a step back and see if we can find a way of moving forward on this issue that avoids or reduces that polarization and sense of division. It might not have worked, but I wish I had done that.
My last question, Nicola, and thanks for all your time. You write a lot in the book about COVID and how heavily that weighed on you. And then you say that after you gave evidence to the COVID inquiry, you came close to a breakdown. You cried on and off for days. You couldn't get out of bed. You were blaming yourself for people dying. And that, I think, is that the only time you've actually gone and sought professional help?
Yeah.
Without ending on too much of a downer, just tell us about that.
I can see it now as almost the straw that came close to breaking the camel's back in that period. I think if all the other stuff that I had faced since standing down as First Minister hadn't happened, then that COVID inquiry experience might not have had that impact on me. It was accumulation of things, and it brought me to that point. And it was a friend who said to me, you should talk to somebody. And I've always, maybe West of Scotland kind of mentality about these things that, and wrongly I should say, I'm utterly wrong about this, but I suppose I've always had that sense of going to seek professional help is a sign of weakness. But the friend talked me into it. I went to see a counsellor and it helped me hugely. And it didn't take long, a few sessions of actually talking to somebody with a bit of distance and obviously training for me to bring myself back out of the kind of hole I'd fallen into. And I suppose that's maybe the sort of, sharpest illustration of what I've kind of learned over the past couple of years. Because the past couple of years for me have been the most testing of my life. And a lot of it's played out across the media, so I don't need to go into it all. And I'm often struck by a sense that if you had, a few years ago, put in front of me this scenario that would unfold, I would have said, I won't survive that. I just won't be able to get through that. And yet I have. And I've had really low, dark moments along the way, but through inner resilience, through recognizing I needed professional help at one stage, through friends who have been much better friends to me than I've ever been to anybody else in the past, something I hope to put right in future. I've come through a really difficult time and can say hand on heart that I'm probably happier than I've ever been before. And so there's something in, I'm not a different person, I'm the same person, but I've got a different perspective and outlook on life today. And while I wish that certain things hadn't happened, that's probably a healthy place to be.
Nicola, final one from me. Looking forward, you've had this extraordinary role as First Minister. I mean, it's something very, very few people get, a chance to play a central role in the government of a whole nation. And now you're young.
Thank you. I am.
You're mid-50s. I mean, you've been in politics almost all your life. I mean, you've known almost nothing else. You've got another at least 20 years of working life ahead of you. And I guess maybe this is therapy for me and Alastair as well. But how do you think about what you do next, which will genuinely give you that level of fulfillment and depth that's remotely comparable to what you did in the first half of your life?
Please don't say podcasting.
I'm coming for you. I'm going to basically launch a rival podcast. I'm not. So I think because the last couple of years have been so tumultuous and, unexpected and unusual, I kind of need a bit of time to rebalance myself and just enjoy being out of some of that. I think, so a couple of sort of random thoughts on this, and I think a fair bit about it. I think being First Minister or being Prime Minister of a country, it's so unique. You can't replicate that in anything else you do. And looking, I think, at some leaders, naming no names, I think the ones who possibly struggle most are the ones who try to replicate that. And so I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. For me, it's about finding or discovering or rediscovering what else in life gives me fulfillment and happiness. And I use that second word very deliberately. I don't regret anything about the career path I took. It's been a huge privilege and, I don't regret a second of it. And this has been my choice. I sacrificed certain things along the way. I didn't do a lot of the things people of my age and stage in life would have done. And I sometimes think I'm going to have a period of maybe living life a bit back to front and just taking the luxury of enjoying certain things, of finding fulfillment and happiness in other ways, and just enjoying the kind of luxury of being able to pick and choose of where I happen to be in the world at any given time, what I want to do, and find, not by trying to force it, but through a process, just finding where I can make a difference, what I want to use the voice I've got, such as it is, to try to influence and what things make me a happy person. Very
good. Well, listen, you two have been getting on far too well, but we'll have to come back another time to discuss your observations. I don't know if you spotted this one, Rory. Having had the opportunity to observe the royal family up close, I have little doubt that history, however long the sweep of it may be in this respect, will look back on the Queen's death as the beginning of its end. Rory will not agree with you on that one, Nicola, but we're going to have to leave it there.
That's an episode in and of itself.
I think it is, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. And I'm in Scotland too, facing some very extreme weather, so I hope you have a safe afternoon.
And you.
So, Rory, your former leader.
Listen, just to come back to my complete obsession with the idea that when people become ex-politicians, they become much more interesting.
Yeah.
That was a Nicola Sturgeon I barely recognize.
Really?
Yeah, I was talking yesterday to Ruth Davidson, who I admire immensely, and she was complaining that, and she really knew her well, 10 years against her in Scottish Parliament, that Nicola Sturgeon used to have this stock in trade where she'd say, of course, I've made a few mistakes, but she'd never give you a single example. It was total sort of stainless steel. And suddenly today, having gone in thinking, my goodness, we're going to have to work hard to get her to open up, she was natural, open, self-reflective, self-critical. People, real nerds, can watch some of my previous encounters with her. I was on Question Time with her. I was taking testimony from the thing. At the select committee, as they say, very, very stiff, brittle, defensive. And suddenly there was this incredibly attractive human person that I warmed to immensely.
I said right at the start that she says in the book that she felt it was a form of therapy, and I think it has been. If you think about, what the last couple of years have been like for fairly obvious reasons to do with an ongoing criminal case, she didn't want to get into it.
And just to interrupt, because we didn't quite explain this to people. You mentioned briefly at the beginning, but for people to understand, her husband was arrested, charged with embezzlement, rearrested. The police were photographed going into her house, going through her drawers, digging up the garden.
She was arrested.
She was arrested and now being clear. And this was somebody who, when she stepped down, was at the absolute pinnacle. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy, and then was crashed down in an instant to being portrayed as a criminal, a villain, corrupt, etc. So, unbelievable.
I've said to you before that I'm not a nationalist. I'm very proud to be British. I'm very proud to be Scottish. In fact, one of the things that I liked in the book very early on, she talked about one of her grandparents who was, quotes, English by birth but Scottish by choice, which is exactly what I am because of my family background and so forth. But I've always found in her, I think I've always spotted this very strange mix of the shy and the quite sort of inward looking, and somebody who nonetheless has a sense of how you operate in the limelight. I mean, we were joking about it after we'd finished the recording, when the very, very first time I met her, and she was a real rising star at the time. She'd been made health minister. Everybody was saying she's the one who's going to take over as first minister. And I was doing this charity bike ride up in Scotland for leukemia research, as it was then known, now called Blood Cancer UK. And she and I were the star attractions at this thing. So I thought, really looking forward to having a good chat with Nicola. We could toddle along on the bike for a few hours. Anyway, needless to say, it was pelting with rain. And she was very, very cold. I mean, really quite cold. And I remember saying to friends, gosh, that Nicola Sturgeon, she was really, really cold. Then I got to know her a bit better subsequently. And I once said to her, why were you so cold? First time I ever met her, was frankly because it was a horrible day, but also because I was absolutely terrified of you. Because at the time, you had this image of the sort of, the big fat controller who was in charge of everything. And
there's also something in this anecdote which you're not quite getting across, which we've got from Nicola, which is you describe yourself as going on a happy toddling bike ride. Her memory of it is the maladaptively, overly competitive Alastair speeding into the thing. There's no chance for conversation at all.
No, Rory, that's because my intention was to have a nice little leisurely bike ride and then win. But because she'd been so sort of chilly, I thought, sod it, I'll just win the race. But then of course, I think the only reference to me in the book, which she was joking about after we finished the interview, is where she says that I was relentless in persuading her to come out for the People's Vote campaign and the second referendum on Brexit. We didn't really get into Brexit, but that was when I I guess had most to do with her. And I agree with you, by the way. I felt at that point that with Johnson in power in the UK, Britain out of Europe, and Labour struggling in Scotland, I thought if they don't get it over the line now, I'm not sure they ever will.
And of course, there are people in the SNP, I think, who have a sort of feeling, which she would say is unfair, that maybe if Alex Salmond had been leading them, he would have been able to bring off that magic, that he would have taken that risk, that he would have found a way of forcing the Westminster government. Certainly that's what we as Scottish Tories felt. I mean, very much the advice we were sending to Westminster, and we were wrong, was no, Boris can't oppose the signal will of the Scottish Parliament if they really want to do so. I mean, we were desperately saying, listen, this was a once-in-a-lifetime decision. That's what the SNP said. It's got to be 20 years before the next referendum. But we were really, really worried. We didn't have enough time because it's amazing. I mean, it's a brilliant 2 hours, and I really loved the way that we went naturally from conversation to conversation. But the question I had up my sleeve that I would have liked to ask is about education. And it is actually about what she actually achieved as First Minister. So she said 10 years ago that closing Scotland's education attainment gap was her political priority. She said, let me be clear, I want to be judged on this. She didn't succeed there. And in fact, education in Scotland's getting even worse under her successors. The figures from February show the number of kids leaving schools with no qualifications in Scotland is at its highest for 15 years. And that, I guess, is something that Anna Sawar and others, and indeed my former colleagues in the Conservative Party in Scotland, will keep pointing out, which is, despite all the razzmatazz, despite all the popularity, the performance on things like education, some people might even say health, was not what it should have been. And that's maybe something, if we have a third go at her.
When we talk about the end of the monarchy.
Well, presumably if I'd asked that, I would have got quite a defensive response.
I was in two minds about that as well, because when I put to her that quote from where she talked about her own school not really meeting kids' aspirations. I mean, I do hear from quite a lot of parents in Scotland say, well, it hasn't much, it's still the same.
Well, actually, the figures suggest it's worse, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Scotland's gone from being one of the best educational records in Europe.
Yeah, but I think one of the reasons why you enjoyed it much more as an interview is neither we nor she allowed it to become a kind of, we were better than you, Labour's better than the SNP or whatever. So no, I'm glad you enjoyed it, because I know I've heard your many, many doubts. I will get so much grief from my friends. I'll tell them now. Anas, yes, you could say what you like. Anas Sawar, Douglas Alexander, he always gives me a hard time for being nice to Nicola. Catherine MacLeod always tells me off. But you cannot deny. And the other thing I've got to say, I was, as I often do, I was imagining my family listening to the podcast. And I, that stuff she was saying at the end about, stuff that you believe in, you have to fight for it. You don't lean into the people who completely disagree with you.
Yeah.
So, on issues like climate and trans and economic inequality and all the rest of it. And immigration, indeed.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And of course, my own apology to Ruth Davidson, who will have felt that I wasn't as tough as I should have been. But no, I really was taken with it. And I do think actually she revealed in that interview why in the end she is a little bit different from Theresa May. She was right to say that they both in some ways are quite introverted figures. But she's got a capacity now for informality, humour, self-criticism, which I think is really charming. I really was taken with it.
Good. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Alastair.